Russia, an imperialist ideology, aggressive policies, and a fierce leader. In short, one of today's global power is Russia. As one of the most powerful nations in the 21st century, Russia's autocratic regime and expansionist policies have led the country to become the host for global unrest. Although the current regime of the Russians inevitably brings a scenario that is full of conspiracy theories, such as a potential World War III, but none of the events so far have been able to convince my government to draft me into the military. That's why I'm happy to make a video about Russia and Putin at my home, instead of working in a military factory. Is there a forest fire in America? It could be the work of Russian intelligence. Is there a dictator in Syria that is hated by the people? If you want to overthrow him, you should start by making Russia stop its support. This is the level that Russia has reached in terms of global power. The fact that Russia plays an active role in Western politics and caused international problems made its relationship with the Western countries all-time low. The leading style of Vladimir Putin, who is the head of state in today's Russia, has also been effective in this regard. The autocratic authority in Russia has become such that if Putin is hostile to Finland, Russian state is hostile to Finland too. If Putin doesn't love you, there's no way you can stay in Russia peacefully. In the current situation, the Russian state has become equal to Putin. Putin's regime cannot be questioned and not in danger, because he either imprisoned or expelled all opposition journalists and party leaders from the country, making him the one and only leader of Russia. Although his iron fist made him famous on social media and became a respected figure, it lost its influence after the war in Ukraine. But what if all this is actually a delusion? What if in reality Putin and Russia are weaker than they actually are? And all of this is just a propaganda in the media? But to understand this, we must first look at the war with Russia and Ukraine, and then the recent uprising by a close friend of Putin. This uprising against Putin by the Wagner Group, even though resolved with the involvement of the Ministry of Defense, left a question in people's minds regarding Putin's power in the country. So, who is Vladimir Putin exactly? How did Wagner challenge this authority and make significant progress at the start? Why did Russia's politics become more aggressive in the 21st century? And what can we expect in the future? Before I overwhelm you with more questions, let's break things down and travel back in time. The year is 1917, and the Bolsheviks launched a massive uprising in Russia, bringing the First Worker Revolution, which replaced the imperial regime with the formation of the Soviet Union. After the Soviet Union came out of the Second World War, it entered into a power race with America. Two different states tried to spread their two different ideas to the whole world. They had different ideas on every issue. However, don't let this mislead you, as when it came to threatening world peace, they were almost on par with each other. During the Cold War period, in addition to arms, space, and economic competitions, spies entered the scene as well. If you were a young Russian during that time, your ultimate aspiration was to become a spy in a capitalist country. Impressed by these spy stories, Vladimir Putin started working for Became a Spy Like Others. The generation in which Putin was born is quite different from today's young generation. They analyze the Second World War differently and view it as the beginning of everything, adopting a nationalist stance on the matter. Of course, Stalin's propaganda during and after the war played a significant role in this perception. Despite facing economic turmoil and numerous challenges, the Soviet Union found a brilliant way to distract the attention of its people: nationalism. Through this, Soviet propaganda reached its peak, leaving a deep impact on the younger generations. However, this propaganda movement went to extremes and almost reached the point of brainwashing. They managed to create a nationalist view by creating posters, movies, and stories that are legendary but mostly exaggerated. This is the era in that Putin is born, and he is influenced by this propaganda to become an agent. However, due to having only completed high school, his application is initially rejected. This led Putin to focus on his education, and in his next attempt, his application is finally accepted. At that time, being a spy in West Germany was the trend, so he learned German in order to join his friends. Later on, the intelligence agency assigns him as an agent to East Germany. But don't think of him doing anything fancy as a spy, because Putin is not in West Germany but in East Germany. Thus, his coolest activity is simply ordering pizza at his home using his real name. Putin was dissatisfied with his work life and spent the whole day as a desk employee in a room. Just before he quits his job, the Cold War had come to a conclusion. Capitalist United States won, and the Soviet Union dissolved into many countries. When Putin returned to Russia, the power was in the hands of someone named Boris. Boris was quite careless and lazy. It was the time that Putin got introduced to politics, starting his political career as an advisor to a city mayor. However, he didn't stop there and quickly climbed the ladder to become the prime minister. But the real power still remained with President Boris. So Putin threatened to expose his corruption and forced him to resign. With the president's resignation, Putin legally assumed the country's leadership. But there were only 3 months left until the upcoming election, and nobody knew him. To avoid losing the election, he realized he had to act fast as possible. At that time, the country was suddenly struck by explosions, and terrorist attacks created an atmosphere of fear among the Russian people. Consequently, they began to see Putin as their savior, and with each explosion, his popularity increased day by day. It was later revealed that a significant part of these bombings were organized with Putin's approval. Taking advantage of the turmoil, Putin blamed these attacks on Chechen militias and promised action if he is elected. This was how Russia stepped into its first democratic election. As anticipated, the election outcome played in Putin's favor, securing him a significant victory and consolidating all the power in the nation under his control. After the Soviet Union's collapse, Putin held different views compared to the politicians of that era. He believed that the Soviet Union was now history, and Russia needed to make its own economic and political choices, rather than copy the Soviet model. Putin's ideas were initially criticized by the communists, but he paid no attention to them. During the early years of his leadership, Putin established different relations with the West. Hostility towards the West had been a typical Russian policy, but Putin temporarily put it aside and made relatively good relations with the Western countries. Putin wanted to strengthen Russia to the level of the Soviet Union, but he did not want to make it in an aggressive way until he encountered a setback in his plans. The reason was that, instead of establishing closer ties with Russia, the former Soviet states chose to make good relations with the West. Consequently, many Eastern European countries joined NATO, including the Baltic states. This NATO expansion posed a serious concern for Russia's major cities and made Putin to reconsider his stance towards the West. Putin no longer wanted his neighboring countries to align with the United States, so he decided to adopt a more aggressive policy. Firstly, he declared that Russia did not recognize the NATO agreement made by Boris. According to this agreement, Russia promised that it will not make an aggressive stance against any country that wanted to join NATO. Putin ignored it, saying that it's a threat to Russia's future. Putin's recent political moves have raised concerns, especially for the United States. Rather than following a calm stance, Russia now shows itself a potential threat to countries that are willing to side with America. These aggressive policies have led Russia to annex Crimea from Ukraine and later supported separatist groups, leading to unrest within Ukraine. Another notable incident is the invasion of Georgia. At that time, Georgia wanted to become a part of NATO and was strengthening its ties with the Western countries. However, Putin invaded Georgia to stop it from joining NATO and suspending all of the country's Western-oriented policies. Putin's authoritarian approach and his denial of giving rights of freedom to former Soviet nations led him to face a difficult challenge. In the present day, he suffered defeat in the invasion of Ukraine, assuming that Ukraine would be an easy target for invasion. Much like other ones, Putin's idea failed when faced with the fierce resistance of the Ukrainian people. The defeat of his forces in Ukraine even caused internal unrest in Russia and even made the whole world think that Russia is not as strong as it was thought.